It began with a knock at the door. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe she was asleep. Maybe she never even saw him coming. We'll never know for sure. But what we do know is that on a summer night in 1988 in Alabama town, the life of 29-year-old Karen Lane ended in a way no one deserves. She wasn't just murdered, she was attacked with such force, with such rage, that even hardened investigators couldn't shake the memory of that room. And standing at the center of it all was a man named Gregory Hunt, a former boyfriend. A man with keys to her apartment. A man now counting down the final hours of his life inside Holman Correctional Facility, waiting to become one of the first people in history executed with nitrogen gas. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell icon for me true crime stories. Gregory Hunt was born in Alabama in 1960, into a time and place where the world moved slowly and expectations were modest. He grew up in a working-class family, one of several children, in a household that held tightly to routine and tradition. The kind of upbringing where emotions were rarely expressed, and silence filled the space between family members more often than words. There was nothing remarkable about his early years, no signs of greatness, no indications of danger. Just a boy navigating a quiet childhood in a town that hardly changed with time. In school, Gregory went mostly unnoticed. He wasn't the kind of student who made waves. He kept to himself, earned average grades, and never got into serious trouble. Teachers remembered him only faintly, quiet, respectful, but distant. He seemed to blend in so completely with the background that it was easy to forget he was there at all. He didn't play sports. He didn't join clubs. He existed, passed through, and left no lasting impression. As he moved into adulthood, that same pattern continued. He worked a series of manual labor jobs, factory shifts, construction sites, odd jobs that paid just enough to get by. Coworkers described him as polite but private. He didn't talk much during breaks. He rarely socialized after hours. He showed up, did what was asked, and went home. There was no ambition. No plans for the future. Just a man living day to day. His relationships followed a similar path. Brief connections. Nothing long-lasting. There were women, but not many, and none who stayed. One or two tried to understand him, but most drifted away, finding him too emotionally unavailable, too hard to read. Gregory didn't argue. He didn't chase after them. He simply moved on, retreating further into himself each time. And then came Karen Lane. She was bright, ambitious, a 29-year-old woman trying to build a life for herself. Independent and outgoing, she worked hard, made friends easily, and had a reputation for being kind and grounded. The details of how they met are uncertain. Some say it was through friends. Others claim it happened at a local convenience store. But what is known is that by early 1988, Gregory Hunt and Karen Lane were briefly involved. The relationship was short, like few weeks. Karen, according to friends, wasn't interested in anything serious. She liked him but not enough to let things grow. Eventually she ended it, firmly but without confrontation. It wasn't a breakup filled with screaming or threats, rather it was a quiet one. And for Karen it was over. But for Gregory it wasn't. He hadn't let go. Despite the briefness of their time together, he remained fixated. He continued showing up, calling, appearing at her workplace without warning. Karen's friends say she was unsettled but never truly afraid. She thought he was lonely. Misunderstood. She didn't think he was dangerous. She didn't change her locks. She didn't know he still had a key. And she didn't know what was coming. August 2, 1988 began like any other summer day in Cordova, Alabama. The heat hung thick in the air, the kind that clings to everything and slows time down. Karen Lane went about her routine, unaware that the hours she was living would be her last. She spent the day in town, stopping at the store, speaking to friends, returning to the small apartment she called home. There was no sign of danger. No hint that death was waiting just beyond her door. Gregory Hunt had spent the day differently. By that point, the breakup had consumed him. Those close to Karen would later testify that he had been calling her repeatedly in the weeks leading up to that day. Showing up unexpectedly. Trying to see her. Trying to change her mind. But the door had closed. And on August 2nd, Gregory made the decision that if he couldn't have her, no one would. Sometime after dark, Hunt arrived at her apartment. He used the key he had never returned. He let himself in. What exactly happened next has been pieced together through forensic evidence, police reports, and courtroom testimony, but what's known is chilling. Karen Lane was ambushed inside her home. What followed wasn't just an act of violence, it was an explosion of rage so brutal, so sustained, that seasoned investigators would later describe it as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever witnessed. Karen suffered more than 60 individual injuries. her body showing signs of blunt force trauma to her head, face and chest. She had been struck with a bar stool, beaten with a broomstick and kicked repeatedly after falling. Her apartment, once a place of peace, was transformed into a chamber of horror. There were signs that she fought back desperately. Broken furniture, torn objects scattered across the floor. But the force of the attack overwhelmed her. Gregory didn't stop. Not when she cried out. Not when she fell. Not even when she was already unconscious. The physical assault continued until she could no longer move, no longer breathe. And still he kept going. What drives a person to cross the line from obsession to slaughter? How does rejection turn into annihilation? It wasn't just a murder, it was a massacre. By the time first responders arrived, the scene inside was almost too much to process. Officers described blood spattered across the walls and floor, the apartment in shambles, and Karen's body lying motionless amid the destruction. One paramedic would later say in court, "I've seen accidents, shootings, stabbings. But this was different. You could feel the violence in the air." Another officer, in tears during his testimony, admitted he had nightmares for months after what he saw that night. During the trial, the prosecution painted a haunting picture. A man consumed by obsession, driven not by impulse but by a deliberate, escalating intent to destroy the woman who had rejected him. Jurors listened in silence as the medical examiner described the extent of Karen's injuries: fractures, internal bleeding, crushing trauma. One quote from the transcript echoed through the courtroom: "It wasn't just overkill. It was punishment." Karen Lane had tried to move on. She had tried to live her life, to leave a toxic relationship behind. But on the night of August 2, 1988, Gregory Hunt made sure she never got the chance. In the aftermath of the brutal murder, detectives turned their attention to the one name that kept coming up: Gregory Hunt. It didn't take long for suspicion to harden into something more. Just days after Karen Lane's death, Hunt was brought in for questioning. He denied everything. Claimed he hadn't seen her. Claimed he had nothing to do with it. But the evidence was already stacking up against him, and the physical trail he left behind told a different story. Inside Hunt's possession, investigators found clothing stained with Karen's blood. The tests were conclusive. The blood type matched, and later, with advancing DNA analysis, prosecutors would confirm that the blood on his clothing was a direct link to the victim. This wasn't just circumstantial. It was forensic confirmation that placed Gregory Hunt at the heart of the crime. Fingerprint analysis further sealed that connection. Several prints found inside Karen's apartment matched Hunt's, even in areas where he had no reason to be, like the broken broomstick and the edge of the barstool used in the assault. Investigators also found smudges near the doorframe and inside the bathroom, pointing to a frenzied attempt to clean himself up before leaving the scene. But no amount of wiping could erase the evidence. One of the most damning pieces of physical proof came from DNA, a technology still emerging in the late 1980s but powerful enough to sway a jury. Strands of hair, skin cells, and traces of blood were found in places that only Karen and her killer could have touched. In the courtroom, forensic experts walked jurors through the science step by step, laying out how every piece of DNA linked back to Hunt. And then there were the lies. During multiple interviews with police, Hunt's story shifted repeatedly. He first claimed he hadn't seen Karen in weeks. Then when pressed he said he might have stopped by, but couldn't recall when. Later still, he admitted he had gone to her apartment, but said she was alive when he left. Law enforcement officials noted that his demeanor was unusually calm for someone being investigated in a homicide. But as the hours wore on, his answers became harder to believe. He couldn't explain the blood. He couldn't explain the broken furniture. He couldn't explain how his fingerprints ended up on a weapon used in the murder. And in the end, the inconsistencies in his statements would be used against him as evidence of guilt. The trial of Gregory Hunt began in 1990, 2 years after the murder of Karen Lane, and from the moment the court proceedings opened, it was clear that this was more than just a legal process. It was a reckoning. The courtroom in Jefferson County, Alabama, was packed with reporters, family members, and community members who had been haunted by the brutality of Karen's death and were now hungry for justice. Hunt stood accused of 3 capital murder charges. The prosecution argued that not only had he taken Karen's life, but he had done so in the commission of 2 other felonies, robbery and sexual assault, elevating the crime to capital status under Alabama law. Prosecutors detailed the sequence of events with unrelenting precision, showing how Hunt had entered the apartment uninvited, assaulted Karen with relentless violence, and stolen from her afterward. They presented evidence suggesting the motive was more than rage. It was control, domination, and final punishment. The prosecution's narrative was built on layers of evidence: physical, forensic, and emotional. They reminded jurors of the 60 injuries found on Karen's body, the broken household items turned into weapons, the DNA linking Hunt to the scene, and his multiple conflicting statements to investigators. They painted a chilling portrait of a man who, upon losing control over his ex-girlfriend, chose to exact ultimate revenge in the most brutal way imaginable. But Hunt's defense told a different story. His attorneys worked to cast doubt on the strength of the prosecution's case. They argued that some of the forensic evidence was inconclusive, that the timeline left room for other possibilities, and that Hunt had no prior criminal history. They emphasized his quiet demeanor in court, his cooperation with authorities during initial questioning, and tried to frame the investigation as emotionally charged and overly reliant on assumption. Yet the jury wasn't swayed. After days of testimony and cross-examination, and after the court heard the full autopsy report in excruciating detail, the jury returned a verdict. Gregory Hunt was guilty of capital murder. The courtroom fell silent as the decision was read. Karen Lane's family members sobbed quietly in the front row, clinging to one another as a wave of painful relief washed over them. Then came the sentencing phase. The jury was asked to decide whether Hunt should spend the rest of his life behind bars, or be sentenced to death. The vote was not unanimous. One juror dissented, but by an 11-1 margin the decision was made. Gregory Hunt would face the death penalty. In the emotional final moments of the trial, members of Karen Lane's family stood and gave their statements. Her mother spoke through tears about the life Karen never got to finish, the dreams she had, the laughter she shared, the pain they all carried since that night. Her father's voice cracked as he described the moment he got the call that his daughter had been killed. "No parent should have to bury their child like this," he said. "She didn't just die. She was destroyed." And with that the trial came to a close. The man who had once stood at Karen's side as her boyfriend now stood as her convicted killer, condemned by a jury of his peers and sentenced to death. Following his conviction and death sentence, Gregory Hunt began a long and determined journey through the appellate courts, a process that would span over 3 decades. Throughout those years, Hunt never denied that he had killed Karen Lane. He admitted to the act, but he consistently rejected the prosecution's claim that he had sexually assaulted her, a charge that was key to elevating the case to capital murder. His legal team filed a series of appeals at both the state and federal levels, arguing that his trial had been fundamentally flawed. Among the most pressing claims was that Hunt had received ineffective assistance of counsel during his original trial. His attorneys, they said, failed to challenge certain forensic conclusions and didn't adequately push back against the prosecution's timeline. Other appeals challenged the validity of the physical evidence, including the interpretation of DNA samples and whether some of the injuries presented during the trial could definitively be attributed to a sexual motive. Year after year, court after court reviewed his petitions, but none were moved to overturn the verdict or sentence. Judges consistently ruled that the evidence of guilt remained overwhelming, and that the claims raised during the appeals did not meet the high bar required for relief. By the 2000s and into the 2010s, the legal filings slowed, but Hunt remained on death row, occasionally submitting new motions for reconsideration or clemency, none of which gained traction. Despite the passing of decades and the growing scrutiny of capital punishment in the U.S., Hunt's sentence remained intact. In the end, the appeals process that began as a hope for reversal became a long countdown toward an execution that the state of Alabama never wavered on carrying out. In the final years of Gregory Hunt's time on death row, the state of Alabama introduced a dramatic and controversial shift in how it carried out capital punishment, a new method known as nitrogen hypoxia. Rather than relying on lethal injection, which had become increasingly difficult to administer due to drug shortages and botched executions, Alabama moved toward what it called a more humane alternative, depriving the condemned of oxygen by replacing it with pure nitrogen gas. Nitrogen hypoxia is a method that causes death by asphyxiation. The individual is fitted with a mask or hood, and pure nitrogen is introduced, cutting off the oxygen supply to the brain and vital organs. Advocates claim that the method is painless, leading to unconsciousness within seconds and death within minutes. However, its clinical use as a means of execution is untested and largely theoretical. No medical body endorses it, and it's never been studied under peer-reviewed ethical frameworks. The state's first use of nitrogen hypoxia was on Kenneth Eugene Smith in January 2024. That execution drew international attention, not only because it was the first of its kind, but because of disturbing reports about how it was carried out. Witnesses described Smith writhing and gasping for air for several minutes before he finally went still. Human rights organizations immediately condemned the method as experimental, inhumane, and deeply flawed. Legal experts and scholars argued that Alabama was essentially using its death row inmates as test subjects in a procedure with no medical oversight or precedent. Despite the backlash, Alabama doubled down. The state refined its nitrogen protocol and moved forward with plans to use the method again. Among those scheduled under this new execution method was Gregory Hunt. He became the 5th person in Alabama, and the 2nd publicly known, to face death by nitrogen hypoxia. For Hunt, the shift in method meant that even as legal options faded, the public debate around his execution grew louder. Advocacy groups argued that no one, regardless of their crime, should be subjected to what they called a scientifically unproven and ethically reckless death. But for the state, it was about following through on justice delayed, no matter the controversy. As the clock ticked down toward Hunt's scheduled date, one question hovered over the entire process. In trying to make executions more efficient, had the state crossed a moral and constitutional line? As spring turned to summer in 2025, the legal machinery that had been grinding slowly for more than 3 decades suddenly began to move with finality. The Alabama Supreme Court cleared the last legal hurdle, formally authorizing the Department of Corrections to carry out Gregory Hunt's execution using nitrogen hypoxia. With the court's ruling in hand, Governor Kay Ivey signed the execution order, an official directive that designated the week of June 10, 2025, as the window during which Hunt's life would end. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, the site of Alabama's death chamber, shifted into preparation mode. Security protocols were tightened. The specialized nitrogen hood and equipment already used once before were checked, tested, and set aside for what would soon be their second use. Correctional officers assigned to the Death Watch unit rotated into position, responsible for monitoring Hunt around the clock. Meanwhile, prison chaplains visited him more frequently, offering counsel, prayer, or silence, whatever he would accept during these final moments. In the days leading up to the execution window, the emotional weight inside Holman grew heavier. Death row, a place long defined by waiting, transformed into a space of quiet inevitability. Gregory Hunt was moved to a holding cell just steps from the execution chamber, a stark, fluorescent-lit room where he would remain under constant surveillance until the moment arrived. Outside the prison walls, victims' advocates called it justice at last, while opponents of capital punishment renewed their pleas for clemency or delay. But time was no longer measured in years of litigation. It was measured in hours, in meals, and final visitations. On June 10, the state would begin the 30-hour execution window, during which Hunt could be led into the chamber at any time deemed appropriate by the warden and state officials. For Hunt, this was no longer about appeals or arguments. This was the countdown, real and irreversible. These are the final days of Gregory Hunt, and whether viewed as justice fulfilled or a controversial chapter in America's death penalty history, there was no longer any denying that the end is near. The story of Gregory Hunt is about more than just one man or one murder. It's about justice, the pain it leaves behind, and the choices we make when deciding who lives and who dies. For more gripping true crime stories, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Don't miss what's coming next.